Alright guys, so I did promise yesterday that I'll be doing a tier list for all of the future UR and SP character on my recommendations of how many dupes do you actually want ideally on every single one of them. So here you guys go. Now obviously with all kind of like dupe tier list, any character is going to get huge benefit when you actually get to 6 dupe, and same thing, all of the UR characters are actually kind of good enough that even if you don't put any dupes on them, they are still very much playable. So this is much more of a recommendation so that you guys know how far in advance you need to save if you do actually want to be more competitive and you kind of know where to best optimize your resources. Okay, now you will see some terminology that I use a lot here, especially at the top where I say mechanics or stats bar. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that sometimes when you actually have a dupe resonance skill, he actually offers a brand new game mechanic for those characters. So as a result, it's going to be a quite big of game changer because it actually would then means your players can actually be played in a certain slightly new play style, and as a result, it adds a lot more flexibility. And to be honest, a lot of time those characters are not really complete until you have those new game mechanics for them. Whereas for the ones where I just say a stats buff, basically it's just normally going to be an increase in certain stats for either himself or for the whole team. Now you may be thinking, okay, well, sure, the stats bar sounds nice, but I can always bridge that gap with some potentials. Yes, however, some of the stats buff when they actually get their resonance skill is absolutely insane. I'm going to take an example, which is probably the most extreme example. SP version Bakuto can get up to 150% crit damage increase when you actually have all his stacks up. That's insane. There's no way you can bridge that gap with potentials or with memories or anything like that. So a lot of the ones, even though it may just be a flat stats increase, the gap that will be provided is so huge that I'm still going to recommendation to actually put some dupes in that in order to get that extra stats buff. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between two. But obviously, for the majority of the time, if you actually introduce a new game mechanic for the character, then I would recommend those first. So starting off at the top, we have the ones which are actually going to essentially get a new play style or new skill mechanics when you actually six tube them. So that's going to be Bakuto and also Orakawa. So Orakawa basically at six tube allow him to surf back to back with his ultimate. So his ultimate cooldown will be reset as long as you win the point into net crossing. That basically means you don't even need a surface. You can surf, they return it, you do a spike kill or block kill, you reset your cooldown, and you can literally fight that back to back. It makes him basically the best surfer in the game, so that's kind of why you kind of want 6 dupes on him. Without that 6 dupe or cover, obviously it's still good, but his advantage over other setters is not then going to be as obvious. So if you're going for all cover, you kind of want 6 dupes. Then for Bakuto is that when he is at 6 dupes, he basically can fire his ultimate back to back. Once again, that's a pretty massive upgrade for him. With this, basically means for the rest of your team, you don't even need to bring any spikers. You can literally just have Bakuto do all the job, and then all of your other members of the team can be a lot more defensive focus instead. So once again, it's going to be a massive upgrade for him. Then we move on to characters which you can go to 2 dupe just to unlock a new skill mechanics for them, or you can also go to 6 dupe to get some more additional crazy buff. So for Sugawara at 2 dupe, basically Sugawara has the same issue as Ataki and Nishinoya in the sense that SSR version of Nishinoya, in the sense that he consumes stamina when he uses his ultimate skill, and his 2 dupes basically gives him a way to actually recover stamina for himself, and that is going to increase his longevity on the field, which is kind of why it's going to be a massive game changer for him. And then obviously when you actually go for 6 dupes, it's stats buff, so up to you whether you want to go that far. Then for SP version of Akashi, he is able to increase team morale when he is actually at 2 dupes, and a lot of time you will be playing him alongside with Bakuto, either version Bakuto, either UR or SP version, and both of them need team morale. So once again, this can increase the ability of your team significantly, because team morale is not just going to boost their stats but also enable Bakuto to do other things. So that's kind of why this is also like essentially introducing new skill mechanics to the team, and then once again 6 is just extra stats, but up to you what you want to do that. For Nishinoya, basically he has a skill which normally only get activated when you are able to get a critical action on your side. However, at 2 dupes, that condition is actually changed to both your side and also your opponent's side. Essentially, you'll be able to accelerate how fast you build up by twice, essentially. So that's basically why it's also going to be a pretty big upgrade for him. And once again, once you get to 6 dupe, he's able to increase the reflex for your whole team. So that's the defensive crit rate. I think it's like base 10%, and if the enemy do a critical hit, it's going to be an additional 15%. So it's still a very, very nice buff, and that's probably still recommended only if you have that resource system, because 25% crit rate is pretty massive, I have to say. Then we move on to other characters, which I personally don't think you need to go to them to 2 dupes at all, because the 2 dupes doesn't offer that big a deal. However, they are able to offer a lot of extra stats buff once you actually go for 6 dupe. So that's kind of why they're in this tier. So starting off with Yu Kageyama. 2 dupes, he is able to essentially get a stack of his own buff whenever he uses it, but it kind of require him to be serving or him to do actually his settle down, which a lot of time that won't actually be happening a lot in the match. So that's kind of why 2 dupe is not that big a deal. And then at 6 dupe, he's actually able to offer I think a 60% flat crit damage, which is insane by the way. I know it's crit damage, so only gonna be taking effect when you actually do a crit. But the same with Kageyama is that he naturally gives a low crit rate by himself already. So it's kind of almost whoever he sets to get a 60% crit damage, and that turns into a 60% straight up damage buff. So it's definitely very insane. And also whenever he uses a skill, he reduces the cooldown of his other skill, and then that allows you to do more things in the match as well. So this is definitely a pretty big upgrade for him, I have to say, at 6 dupes. Then we have Bakuto at 6 dupes. He is basically able to get some additional buff at the end of each turn, I believe. Oh no, sorry. Whenever you exit the morale stage or at the end of each turn, but basically you're able to get some extra buff quite easily, and they do stack up. It takes a long time to stack up. However, like I said, if you're able to stack all the way to the max, 150% crit damage. That makes him the strongest hitter in this game. Like no comparison at all, and it's just too insane for you to ignore that buff. Okay, so that's kind of why 6 dupes is also going to be very good for him. Then we have Kenma. Kenma at 6 dupe is able to actually reduce the opponent crit rate. That is actually pretty insane, because a lot of time in this game you have skills which can only be activated when you do a critical hit. So reducing enemy crit rate is not just as simple as reducing their damage. You also sometimes prevent certain skills from happening. So that's kind of why it's also a massive upgrade for him, but only when it's 6 dupe. Yeah? And then Komari at 6 dupe, he increased a flat 15% defensive crit rate. So very similar to what Nishinoya is able to do, but a slightly higher flat rate than Nishinoya, whereas Nishinoya can go higher if the enemy actually do a critical hit. But the two are kind of very similar, I have to say. So that's kind of why it's also going to be recommended for you to go for 6 dupe, just to increase that crit rate. And once again, remember, crit rate is not just a matter of you doing that extra performance. It can also activate certain other skills effects as well. So that's kind of why anything which can increase crit rate is actually pretty big in this game. Then we move on to the characters which I think 2 dupes is probably going to be necessary. There's no need for you to go to 6 dupe. Obviously, if you have that resources, it would be nice, but I won't say it's mandatory. So starting off, we have Ushijima. At 2 dupes, he's able to fight his ultimate back to back as long as you build your whole team crit base. So that's kind of why it's massive. At 6 dupe, he's actually able to double his own crit rate, but the thing is, normally you can already easily get Ishijima to like 50, 60, 70, 80% crit rate if you actually build the whole team around it. So there's not necessarily much need, because 80% crit rate versus 160% crit rate, you're just doing too much overkill. It doesn't actually make too much a difference. I'm justifying the extra dupes, so that's kind of why I'm saying 2 dupes is going to be enough. Then we have Hirogami. 2 dupes. Actually, I will talk about the next 3 characters together. Hirogami, SP Ione, and also Sakusa. All 3 of them, their game mechanics involve some kind of buff, which they apply themselves, and you get different effects depending on how many stacks of buff there are. However, if you just rely on them to build up those buffs by their own base kit, it's going to be far too slow, and a lot of time you won't be able to see all those nice additional effects. However, once you get all 3 of them to 2 dupes, they are going to increase the way of how they can stack up those buffs, and you're going to see a massive improvement in terms of their gameplay, because you are then able to unlock all those additional effects. So that's kind of why for all 3 of them, I highly recommend at 2 dupes. Whether you want to go for 6 dupe, once again, it's nice to have. Hirogami is able to shut down opponents which are able to do back-to-back ultimate spam. Vast majority of the time, unless you're facing up against the likes of Bakuto or Ushijima, that wouldn't be the case. So while 6 dupes is nice, it's kind of meta dependent. I only 6 dupes is also nice, but it kind of depends on the playstyle you want to play him. I only actually have a special effect in the sense that he is one of the, I think the only character in this game which actually buff your opponent, buff your whole team when he actually rotates out of the field. So if you actually have a liberal to sub him in, or you actually sub him out, he actually buff your whole team instead. So it kind of depends on the play style of how you want to play on it, whether you actually want him to be at the front, do 2 all those blocks, or whether you actually want to sub him out and give a passive buff to your whole team instead. That's going to determine whether you actually want that 6 dupes or not. So that's kind of why it's been more situational. And then sacrifice just a flat stats increase. I could potentially put it on the 6 dupe stats buff, but I think that this one's a bit more conditional, so it's not just as simple as like you will definitely get that buff, but you actually need to fulfill certain conditions. I think it's like your teammates need to do like critical receives or something along those lines in order to actually activate that buff. So that's kind of why, even though it's a nice stats buff, it's a bit too conditional, and it's a bit more team dependent as well. So that's kind of why I think 2 dupes is probably going to be fine, just to make him a bit more universal. Then we have Osamu. Osamu's 2 dupe basically give him like a flat 60% increase in quick spike. Once again, insane damage buff. Now, there's a bit of a condition, which is that the enemy needs to have a type of debuff on them. However, Osamu is able to do that himself. So what that basically means is that for the very first spike that you'll be doing, yes, the enemy are completely clean without any debuff, so you won't be able to activate that 60% buff. However, pretty much afterwards, the enemy will be always constantly on the debuff, and therefore you will always be doing that straight up 60% increase. So that's kind of why it's very nice. And then for SP Hinata, this one's a bit strange one. So at 2 dupe, it's definitely going to be very, very good because his quick spikes, I believe, when it's a critical hit, you actually ignore any blocks, which makes him incredibly strong. Even if you don't build him like with a full attack oriented, that itself already like ignoring blocks is massive. So that's kind of why it's very nice. At 6 dupe, this is probably the only character I probably wouldn't actually recommend at 6 dupes at all. It's because he would actually reduce his own crit rate in order to increase his other stat. And that's very weird. I think he decreased his crit rate to increase his crit damage or something. But then it's like without crit rate, it's actually going to be very, very hard for you to actually then pull off that crit damage. You need to play him in very, very specific team to actually make use out of his 6 dupe. And if you don't play him in those teams, basically his 6 dupe is actually going to harm him because his 6 dupe basically means he can never crit, and then if he never crit, then he can't activate his 2 dupe ability either. So basically, unless you play him in very specific teams, SP's Hanata's 6 dupe can actually harm you more than it helps. So that's kind of why I only recommend going up to 2 dupes for him. Then lastly, we move on to character which can either be 0 dupes or 6 dupes, depending on what kind of team you want to play them in. And I will kind of explain for every single one of them, okay? So starting off with Asumu. Asumu, normally, if you actually want to play him in a Rizaki team, the whole playstyle for Inarizaki is that your team don't want to crit, because when your teammate don't crit, Asumu is actually going to get a buff, and that buff will eventually then be consumed to then buff your teammates instead. And basically, in order for you to quickly stack up those buffs, you kind of need your teammates to not crit. However, what Asumu is able to get at 6 dupe is that whenever he consumes any of those buffs, he immediately start off with 5 buffs. And what that basically means is that you are no longer relying on your teammates not to crit, and that frees up Asumu massively because now you no longer have to play him in a Naruto team. You can actually play him with other members who actually will be critting a lot, and you're still able to offer that buff to every single one of them. And that's kind of why I say it's going to be based on your team, because if you want to play him in a Naruto team, 0 dupe is fine. But if you actually want to pair him up with other characters, for example, Hoshiyumi, Hirogami, who actually relies on crit, then yes, 6 dupe is going to be a massive game changer for Mia, so that he still is able to offer those buff consistently. So that's kind of why I say it's either 0 dupe or 6 dupe, depending on what kind of team you'll be playing him in. Then next we have Yuakuro. Yuakuro is kind of the same thing. He has a complete package where he can do both quick spikes and also blocks. Now, vast majority of the time, depending on what your other teammates can do. For example, if you're actually doing a power spike team and therefore you don't actually need Kuro to do quick spike, then Kuro can focus on his block instead, in which case his 6 dupe is actually going to offer a lot of buff to his block, and that's going to be ideal. However, if you actually play Kuro, let's say in a quick spike team, where you actually need him to do a lot of the quick spiking, and therefore he would have less stamina to do those blocks, then 6 dupe is not going to be massive upgrade for him, because yes, it does increase his block significantly, but you're probably only going to be blocking once or twice because you want to save up his stamina for the back-to-back quick spikes instead. So that's why I say it's going to be dependent on your team build, whether it's necessary to go for 6 dupe. And lastly, we have Hoshiyumi. He's also kind of similar to Kuro in the sense that he's also a complete package. He can do loads of different things. However, at 6 dupes, one thing he's able to activate is that his awareness crit stat and also his defensive crit stat together will be combined, and then both of them will become 0.85% of the total stats. Now, it sounds a bit confusing, but basically, if you actually do the mathematical calculation, you will find out that if there's actually going to be a huge difference between your attack awareness and reflex, which is basically the critical rate for attack and also for defense, and vast majority of the time, Hoshiyumi is gonna get loads of awareness buff because that's just the way his kit is built. If your awareness stats is actually a lot higher than your reflex stat, when you actually combine them and then take the 0.85% of all of them together, what's actually end up going to happen is that you will actually be reducing your awareness stats slightly and then bumping your reflex stats massively. And what that basically means is that if you actually want to play Hoshiyumi as an attacker, this 6 dupe can actually harm him because you would actually be dragging down your awareness stat because the reflex was so low, you are essentially scaling your awareness to only 85% of what it was originally. So that's kind of why it's not going to be ideal if you're Hoshiyumi. It's actually going to be more the attacking role on your team. However, if you actually build a team around where Hoshiyumi is actually more the one doing defense, then what's actually going to be here is that you're not really compromising your attack much, and even if it does, you're not really attacking anyway. However, it boosts your defense reflex stats massively, and then it can become a massive game changer. So that's kind of why this is going to be, once again, very much dependent on whether your whole team is going to need Hoshiyumi to do more offensive roles or more defensive roles in order to decide whether you actually need 6 dupes on him or not.